Okay. Welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Rattler. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. Those of you who have followed this podcast over the past year and a half or so, almost 2 years, in fact, will know that we've been tracking the developments in extremism, radicalisation across the world, not only here in Australia. And what we're noticing in Australia more and more is media are finding out ways to expose people who are members of particular organisations. Now, this highlights the growth of extremist organisations, highlights how people move from one organisation to another. But one of the critical issues to explore is what happens on the side of the person being exposed. Um, what occurs in their mind when they're exposed in the media, and how that impacts on those individuals when things progress. There's somebody who's familiar with that, and will be familiar to some of you who've listened to Critical Line Item over the time, is Jeff Schoep. Now, Jeff's a former uh, extremist. He was the head honcho, main director of the National Socialist Movement for 25 years. He now heads Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is an organisation that aims to encourage people to disengage from extremism and draw themselves out of the life that Jeff and others once had. Jeff, it's great to be back in contact with you. How have things been?
Hey Tom, thanks for having me on the program. Things are busy here, but we're doing good work and trying to make a difference. So thanks for having me on the program again.
Absolute pleasure. Look, one of the things that we spoke about in a previous podcast is looking at the role of the medium and how the media, in some ways, gets played by extremist groups, given the nature of the content, given the way in which that content is well, uh, sort of disseminated, and the tactics that are used, whether it be talkback radio, whether it be stickering campaigns or whatever. Um, what we don't explore, I don't think particularly well, is what happens when an extremist is outed. That is, their name appears somewhere and it becomes a matter of public knowledge, whether it's through Twitter online or whatever else. Um, as somebody who's been doxxed previously in your previous life, what happens?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think it's a great discussion to have because it's something that, excuse me, it's something that a lot of people don't cover or really think about. They just think it's a great idea to dox these people, to expose them, to put it out there online and everywhere, so they have problems in their life, and their the idea behind it, I think, is in a way to shame them and things like that. But as somebody that has been doxxed in the past and has went through that, and is someone now working with Beyond Barriers, we work with people that have been doxxed in the past and things like that, and we do listen to the online chatter and of how people that are doxxed feel as well. So besides what we've experienced ourselves, what we're dealing with directly, we hear a lot of different things from different people. And I can tell you just from my own personal journey and my own personal experience, when I was in the far right movement and I was doxxed or put under pressure in that way, shape, or form, I doubled down. I doubled down on everything that I was doing. I was like, if they think they're going to intimidate me, they think they're going to push me around. Guess what? I'm going to push back. I'm going to be twice as active. I'm going to do more, et cetera, et cetera. And very rarely, in my experience, that the people that have been doxxed, and I can count them on one hand, the number of people that I know of that actually left the movement from being doxxed, I can count on one hand. And most of those people were not hardcore ideologues. They probably would have left. Any little push might have gotten them out. So I don't even credit that to doxing. I think doxing is a negative way of going about things. I don't think it's helpful. And in my experience, it typically further radicalizes. And some of the chatter that we're hearing and some of the things that people are saying about that in particular is that when they're doxxed, even if they want to leave, even if they're thinking about leaving, they feel stuck. Now they feel like, hey, I've forever been, put out online as this individual, this neo-Nazi or whatever it is. I've been put out as this, and it's going to be there forever. And that's so now I'm stuck. I'm stuck with this extremist organization. I have no other options, but I have to stay there. And that's how a lot of them think and feel when that happens. And that's, I would say, in my experience, that's how the majority of them feel. They want to push back, and then even those that do question it, or that feel like later on that maybe they should leave, they feel stuck. And sometimes the leaders of those groups, there was a young man that I just spoke with in the last week, and he had told me before he left the organization that he was a part of, because he was doxxed, he was put out online, and he said, he goes, the leader of the organization told me when I was resigning that I shouldn't leave because I've been put out online and I'll forever be hunted as a Nazi for the rest of my life. And I told this young man, I said, that's not true. And, we'll walk with you. But that's how they feel.
What then happens? I mean, if you look at somebody who ends up losing their employment because of something that's said about them in this context, in your experience, what's happened to those individuals when they've reverted, when they've sort of had spare time on their hands?
Well, so a lot of times when somebody is doxxed, they do lose their employment. That's a pretty common thing that happens. And again, I feel like that pushes them further back into that extremist mindset. And now if they're out of work, it's the families that suffer. Sometimes the children are suffering, the wives, girlfriends, whatever. And a lot of people don't think about that. And then that person has that extra time on their hands, which they're more than likely going to put into the organization and doing even more activism. So now the people that have doxed this individual have cost them their job. They're mad can be. And now they have more time on their hands too. So it's just a vicious cycle.
Is there an example from your time in the movement which was basically half your life, um, that you're able to share in terms of how the doxing specifically affected you?
How it affected me personally?
Yeah.
Well, I can think of one time in particular when I was at a rally, and I was doxxed while I was gone, and the VIN numbers from my car were put out online, all you name it. And so I was out of state, so I sent people over to check on the house and things like that. But again, what it did was it made me angry, and it didn't cause me to second guess anything that I was doing. In fact, it just made me more. It provided more fuel and more anger and I put it back into the organization rather than the opposite. And it's typically, we don't see the opposite happening very often, where a person gets discouraged by that sort of thing. So for me, it just pissed me off, for lack of a better term.
The when we look at what what you said, and the analysis you gave earlier in terms of what what it causes people to do internally, that is in their mind. Um, what does it? I mean, how should we really be dealing with that now as a community? Because it's not. There is a certain voyeurism in sort of exposing groups that are in effect, as you acknowledge, after leaving, they're destructive when it comes to social cohesion and all that kind of thing. How how do we deal with that? Because there's a there's a public interest in understanding that these organisations exist, that individuals are members of them, and that there are times when these groups uh, enter into what is violent extremist activity. That's undeniable. Nobody
Right.
can argue that. No, but so how do you deal with that? Because somewhere along the line, doxing of leaders and coverage of those who are leaders and members will occur. What is the best way in dealing with that in your view?
Well, and I do understand the other side of that is that by exposing the people that are in it, it puts pressure on them. Um, and it has that effect. So I understand both sides of the argument, and I'm not necessarily saying what is right, what is wrong. I'm not necessarily in that position. I'm just
Yeah,
speaking from my own lived experience and how it works. And I think there's a difference between the leadership and the membership. So like your average foot soldier in the movement is not somebody that's out there in front of the cameras. They might be at a rally or something. Excuse me. They might be at a rally or something, but they wouldn't be necessarily speaking in front of the cameras and things like that. Whereas the leaders, they know they're going to be doxxed, and they're out there, and they don't really care. It's not hurting them because they already know that's going to happen. They expect that. But your average foot soldier that's in these movements, um, that's the individuals I feel that really get hurt by the doxing, and then they feel like, if say they second guess it, say it's a phase, say that they're or they've had a change of heart or whatever it might be, later on down the line. Once they've been doxxed, that tactic will be used to keep them in place, to keep them stuck in that movement, even if they don't wholeheartedly believe in it anymore, but to keep them stuck there. And I think that's where um I have a real issue with that. As somebody that was leading from that side, we expected that. That wasn't any surprise. But I think for like the average foot soldier, when that happens to them, it causes a lot of pain. And on the flip side of that, people would say, well, hey, these guys that are in these movements, they're saying hateful things. Some of them are doing hateful things. But I think, in your question, there's something really important was said there too. If and when that traverses over to violence, like say that person is engaged in violence at that point and they're doing illegal activities, then I think that's a little different. I think, the public does need to know who that is and what they're up to, and things of that nature. So I think if somebody's doing something illegal or promoting violence or something like that, then all bets are off. That person needs to be, the public needs to be aware of that. um, so this is, I have a little bit of a different way of looking at these things, I think, than a lot of people do. But that's my opinion on it.
I know we probably be revisiting some discussion we had before, but it's worthwhile going there for completeness. Um, there is a very challenging issue in newsrooms where you see extremist activity of varying kinds, um, that emerges on whether it be on the streets. We've seen it here in Australia in our national capital. There are people who are, you know, who have adopted a particular extreme view on uh, the legitimacy of government, the legitimacy of vaccination mandates, mask mandates, and every other mandate under the sun. It'll get to the point where I start to think that they're out there for a good time. But the how do you think, or what do you think of the way in which the media should be reporting this? Because as we said earlier, there's a there is a public interest in knowing what sort of forces are at play in our community. That's undeniable. What is Jeff Schoep's playbook when it comes to um, reporting responsibly on extremist movements?
Well, I think the first thing is, when reporting on extremist movements, is not to name excuse me.
That's right.
The first thing, sorry about that. The first thing I think that's really important is not to name the particular organizations. I think from a news media standpoint, we can that it is responsible to cover the news and to cover those activities that are going on, but not necessarily to name the group. And I'm saying that from the standpoint of from my former life when I was running the NSM. Anytime the media reported on us, if our name got in the press, that translated into hits to the website, which translated into new people subscribing to our email lists, are joining the group, that sort of thing. Whereas if something was covered and it said, for example, neo-Nazi rally in Kansas City, and it didn't say the organization's name, or it didn't show a picture of, see, the organization, and what I was doing at the time got smart about that too and said, okay, let's have our banner out front that has the website, a phone number, that sort of thing on it. So when they report, they're going to see that. So some media outlets, I've seen this done where they'll blur that out. They'll blur out the web address or that sort of thing, or the organizational name, and just say Nazi rally or something like that. So I think there's that fine line, in my opinion, that you can still cover those things. You can still be responsible from a newsworthy standpoint, but not name the organization. That way they cannot use it to recruit.
What's the? I mean, naming individuals is something else that can cause uh, a bit of sort of a philosophical um, debate. What is it? How do you how do you feel about the naming of individuals in this context?
In the sense of like the spokespeople, or like just generally like every person that's out there.
In terms of the spokespeople of organisations like this.
That's a good question. And that's something that I think it's really difficult to pinpoint that down, because in some cases it's newsworthy to cover that, probably to cover that individual. But at the same time, we don't, I think as a civil society, we don't want to give them that credibility, because on the name recognition alone, then person can look up that individual. They'll say, well, who is this guy or lady that was out there speaking? Oh, well, the media said it was so and so. Well, I'm going to look them up, and then by proxy they can find that person's organization or what they're representing. So that's a tough question. It's tough to say, because I think sometimes, I think if you don't name the individual, then from a news standpoint, um are you doing your job? I don't know. That's a really good question. I got to wrap my mind around this one, because that's a tough one. That's really hard to say. Where is that balance? That's a good question.
Because if, for example, people are on certain messaging apps or are online, they can track. Today they can track that kind of thing down fairly easily, and that's part of the sort of the digital climate that we're in. What you will obviously, through the people you help and your own resources, monitor what goes on online and in messaging apps. Uh, how what are you observing in terms of the growth of far right groups on specific apps that we don't necessarily need to name here?
Well, we're seeing a lot of the we're seeing an increase, I think, in it, and a lot of that has to do with, the things that the world's been through with COVID, where people are feeling isolated. They're shut in. They have more time on their hands. They're not out, having a social life in some cases, and they're finding more time online, and they're discovering these groups. And then you have different aspects where a lot of social media companies don't want this type of rhetoric spewed online, so they're censoring it. And then the people are ending up, the extremists are gravitating to different channels, which we won't name, but they're gravitating to those places where they're more apt to be stuck in an echo chamber, where they don't have anybody questioning them, because they're in their own little, secure bubbles, where that's all they hear. So it's very, it leads to that cult like behavior. And I know we've discussed this before, but where you're in this echo chamber behind these barriers, and all you're hearing, all that you're taking in, from music to news to everything, is propaganda. And then the people around you, your social circle, all back up that same propaganda too. You're not engaging
Mhm.
with the public, and you're not having that free speech.
What should the tech platforms do in this context?
Hmm. Well, my idea on this maybe is not what the mainstream seems to believe, that by censoring these people and censoring free speech, that it's going to somehow put a big dent in it, and it's going to there more people won't be exposed to it. I feel like the free exchange of ideas and ideologies back and forth is important, and it's important to have those discussions, as long as they're not promoting violence, illegal activity. Those kind of things have no place online, in my opinion, and those people should be kicked off of those platforms, and not or prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But um, in other stances, and when we look at freedom of speech and the exchange of ideas, if no one is there to say, like, if you put out something that's just this racist propaganda, and no one is there to say, look, this is why I don't like this is why what you put out is a lie, or it's dishonest, or it's not true, and having that dialogue, having that discussion, civil discourse. If we don't have that in society anymore, I think it encourages the growth of those echo chambers, and allows for extremism to grow in those sectors, whether it's right, left, religious, you name it. I think all those sectors are growing, and I think it's because we don't have that civil discourse anymore, and I think it's a shame.
Let's just expand on that for a moment. Now, there will be those who say that there are certain ideologies that lead naturally to violent activity, right? Um, and if we look at the work of Gordon Allport and social psychologists like him, who've seen movements grow from, the rhetorical through to actual sort of abuse of people on the streets, through to violence, and through to, in the most heinous of examples, obviously, through the sort of extermination or genocide of people who were of a certain faith. Um, where is the line? This is what this is the challenge that we have. Where is the line? At what point do you draw it?
That's a great question. On my own journey out, one of the final straws, when I was looking at, examining my life and what I was doing and things like that, um, I was looking at examples within the organization of people that I knew, that were saying horrible, violent things, and that believed horrible, violent things. And I said to myself, well, I don't believe that. I don't think that, but I still agree with these other things. I'm talking about when I was still in,
Yeah,
and I was trying to make sense of it. And then I've also processed the fact that ideology that I was part of, in some cases, has driven people to go commit acts of violence. So it is a really good question to ask, like, where is that fine line? Where does it go from being just gross, um, ugly rhetoric, to driving somebody to action? Of course, you've got to have personal responsibility. If a person is, going and committing acts of violence on someone else, there has to be personal responsibility. But if an ideology is sort of motivating them to do that, um, where is that line? Is it the ideology, or is it personal responsibility? It's a tough one. It's a tough one. And I mean, as an American, as some, I believe in freedom of speech and everything, but at the same time, I think hate speech is repugnant and ugly. And I think in some cases it has led to people that normally wouldn't be involved in violent things, feeling like, they need to go do something. And this is common in extremism in general, where they feel motivated to go do something for their cause. And that's a pretty common extremist trap.
Now, back, see, one of the things that and people who are aware of your story will know this, but yeah, your conversations with people like Daryl Davis and Dia Khan were uh, very significant, along with others, no doubt. But those two are ones where you've been caught on film having
Yeah.
debate and having discussions, right?
Yep.
The So from around about 2016, if I recall correctly, to 2019, that was your period of um, sort of slow slowly disengaging with the movement. Um, and you left in March of 2019, if my memory serves me correct.
That's right. Yep.
It, my memory hasn't completely gone, even though I'm older than we last spoke. But the thing I wanted to ask is, you would be aware of the moves of different people within your circle at that time. March 2019 was also uh, a fairly significant month in terms of what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand. Did what happened in Christchurch cause you to finally pull the pin on it?
Well, I left like March 3rd. I'm
So
not
that
sure.
well before Christchurch hit.
Yeah. But I did feel like there was other attacks that were happening in that year, or 6 months even before that. I think in that fall there was a major attack, and there was a lot of stuff. It just seemed like those type of things were happening more frequently and more often, where people that were involved in far right extremism were acting out in that sense, and causing harm to people. So um some of those, there was a lot of final straws, and those did play a part for me. I was just like, I don't want to be affiliated with these people. I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is not what I believe in. It's not what I stand for, and it's time to go.
You're now in a different place. You're with Beyond Barriers. It's almost 2 years since you've started the organisation. Am I right?
Yep, I believe the we founded Beyond Barriers in 2020, I believe.
Yeah. So you're essentially in the second year. What what have you been? Without going into too much detail, but what are you seeing in terms of the workload and into radicalization and talking to people about disengagement? Has it grown?
Absolutely. I mean, we've got people reaching out all the time, for help, for help walking away from that life, and just for advice, and different things like that. Um, Trying to make sense of their lives, and put their lives back together. And then they ask questions like that. They ask like, well, will I ever be able to get back out in society, and do things, and be accepted back into society again? And they really struggle with that. Even some of the ones that are not as well known, that haven't been, um it's caused so much damage in their own personal lives, and in their families, and in their personal relationships, and things like that. And they just have like this deep seated distrust for others. So it's a lot of work for people. And there's a lot of times that I'll say to somebody that I'm working with, hey, could I have you talk to somebody else that's on our team, because my workload is just completely slammed. And they're like, no, I don't know who that person is, so I would like to talk with you. So I end up taking on even more cases than probably I should. But I feel like if I can make a difference in somebody else's life, and help them walk out like I did, and like so many others before me did, it's my responsibility. I feel like it's something that I can do to help my country, that I can help humanity as a whole, and I consider it a great honor to be able to do that.
Where to from here? I mean, where's what are the next steps? Because there's obviously a lot of work you've been doing. Are there moves to expand overseas?
Well, we're we're trying to do as much as we can, here in the States and internationally, whatever we can do to make a difference. But you touched on something I think that is really important. And those conversations with Daryl Davis, Dia Khan, and so many other people that helped, that was done. People, they were able to reach me through dialogue. And that's the same thing that we're doing here at Beyond Barriers. And it's not just in the extremist sphere, but we're seeing that this type of thing, what we're doing, we call it relational dialogue, conflict resolution, that these skills that we're using in this program, relational dialogue program that we're using, can be applied into so many aspects of life. Even you have your divisions between the political parties that are seem to be so polarized and so extreme in some ways, that we need to people need to like relearn how to talk to one another. And you find out, even if you disagree with somebody on certain things, we have a lot more in common than we do different. And I think there's a lot of value to that. And that's something that we're seeing that we can teach and help people learn in different aspects. I've had talks with law enforcement, with US government, with some foreign governments on a lesser scale, and then just civic groups, political groups, religious groups, interfaith type of things, and all sorts of things. We're just trying to make a difference wherever we can.
I've been talking to Jeff Schoep, who's the founder of Beyond Barriers and a former um, extremist who's now doing a fair bit of work in trying to get other people out of that life. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure. It's always wonderful to talk with you and keep up all the wonderful things you're doing there in Australia.
Thank you, and but don't be a stranger. We'll do this again at some point.